Hey everyone, I'm Steve from gamersnexus.net, and this is our Black Ops 3 optimization guides. This is a graphics optimization guide that aims to help you in increasing FPS and eliminating some of the more impactful settings when it comes to frame rate, but potentially not as impactful visually. So we're trying to make the trade-off of where can we sacrifice some visual fidelity in exchange for a faster frame rate output, which for multiplayer is the thing that you want the most, of course. So first of all, this was published on the website probably about a week ago now. We published it the day after Black Ops 3 launched, but this is the video version of that. If you need more information, this video will only go so deep with the detail of options that you can tweak. Check the link in the description below for the full guide on graphics optimization within Black Ops 3. But let's just dive into things quickly here. First of all, major note, Black Ops 3 just put out an optimization patch, and that changes our FPS metrics quite a bit. So these metrics we're presenting in this video are the original metrics from the day one launch. That means that in general, you should actually see increased performance over what we had here, but the overall delta, that is the percent difference between settings, say in off versus on or high versus low, that delta value separating the settings levels should be about the same even with the optimization patch. So these steps will still help you in increasing the FPS. The first item to look at is mesh quality. And we have all of these settings defined in the article, but mesh quality is one of the ones that may confuse a few people. Meshes in games are sort of in the same line as objects and textures and all of that, in that they help create the environment that you're looking at. And in some of our examples we've shown, mesh quality is most apparent when looking at things like vehicles and complex models within the environment. Bikes are an example. If you look at sort of the background prefab bikes, mesh quality is what dictates how smooth the model appears and the level of detail within the model. So there might be some items on that model that are present at higher qualities but not present at lower ones, like more circular lights or things of that nature. The next setting is texture filtering, which is basically an isotropic filtering. If you're familiar with that, it's just sort of renamed here. So an isotropic filtering is filtration of the textures. It does a filter pass on the texture that basically aids in how that texture appears to you when it's applied to surfaces at different angles. The best example, and the one that I use the most, is take a road. If you have a road with a dotted line, like a white dotted line as you'd find in real life, and you're standing as I am, and the road is at this kind of angle to you, a perpendicular angle effectively, you're viewing the texture that applies to that road at a non-oblique angle. You are not looking at it 90 degrees head on. So what does that mean? Well, as the road gets further from you and approaches its vanishing point out on the horizon somewhere, as it approaches the vanishing point, the texture, without any kind of anisotropic or texture filtering, will look like it's still applying in squares. It'll look like it gets more blurry and distorted as the road distances itself. So texture filtering basically smooths this out and sort of makes a more trapezoidal application of textures as it gets farther away from you. And this normally has effectively zero impact on performance. There's a small impact in Black Ops 3, but you'll see in the article that it's really not a big deal and you can kind of just leave it on to the max. But that is what texture filtering does. The next one is subsurface scattering, and this is the base layer of what creates deep scattering going forward as graphics advance in the next year or two. But subsurface scattering is a technology that takes skin, especially face, skin, and things like that within Black Ops, and it changes the way that light cascades and propagates through that skin layer. Some games even now have blood mapping in the face. So what subsurface scattering does is it effectively smooths out sort of the cheeks within Black Ops 3 and smooths out the forehead and things like that, and makes those wrinkles and imperfections in the skin look a little bit more real by manipulating the way that light interacts with those very tiny and fine imperfections. So this changes how the light cascades under the surface within the skin, and that changes where the light is brighter or dimmer or what have you when it comes to skin graphics. The final option we're talking about in Black Ops 3 before just jumping into the benchmarks is order independent transparency. And within Black Ops 3, order independent transparency is required for volumetric lighting. And that means that volumetric lighting has a dependency on OIT, which is what I'm abbreviating it to because it's very hard to say order independent transparency over and over. So volumetric lighting is dependent on OIT being on. If it's off, then volumetric lighting must be off. This makes benchmarking interesting, as you see in the article. OIT changes the way that layers of semi or fully transparent objects, textures, particle effects interact with each other. So the best example here, if you go in, I think it's the metro level, I forget the name of it, but it is a metro environment. And you go there, you can see in the background or in the distance that there's a sheet of glass at the border of the level that is occluding the pillars for a bridge in the background. Now this glass is transparent, so even though it's occluding it in that it is physically in front of the pillars, it is not occluding vision to that pillar, so you can still see it. The pillar also has fog in front of it. Fog is semi-transparent. You can see through it to some degree. The same is true for the glass. It is semi-transparent. So OIT takes these multiple layers of semi-transparent items and figures out which one gets drawn first and which one occludes the other, and that way you don't have sort of weird flickering or inaccurate looking transparent effects within the game. So that is what OIT does, and it does have a pretty big visual impact if you're really looking for it, but if you're not looking for it, it is one of those items you can turn off and benefit greatly in terms of FPS without necessarily having a huge impact to your gaming experience. Benchmarking Black Ops is interesting because the performance varies greatly from single player to multiplayer to free running. There's a huge performance disparity depending on what you're playing. And with single player, a lot of that is because they're using higher quality models, more polys, higher quality textures, and more objects, and all of this environment art. It's very cinematic and has a pretty movie-like feel to it, but that means that you're taking a bigger hit to FPS. So we saw, before the optimization patch, mind you, we saw FPS hits of about 37 to 38% from multiplayer to single player. We did all of these tests you're seeing here in multiplayer, and that is because we sort of assumed that going forward, multiplayer will probably be more popular of the two modes. Single player is important, but we only have so much time. So we benchmark multiplayer, and that means some technologies like subsurface scattering, you don't see the full effect of, because within multiplayer, you're never gonna get that close and that much detail and that high poly face animations and drawings, unlike in single player where it's actually a pretty big focus. So you will see more impact of subsurface scattering in single player. You can find RAM and VRAM benchmarks on the website. We saw a memory consumption of about 15.2 gigabytes commit with a working set of 6.7 gigabytes. That means physical memory consumed 6.7, and then virtual memory plus physical 15.2 gigabytes. You can find the rest of that on the site. VRAM is basically whatever is made available to the game through the video card. The first critical item to FPS to turn down is order independent transparency. We saw performance gains of about 13% by disabling OIT completely, which also disables volumetric lighting, so that does mean the benchmark is imperfect because we're now changing two settings, not just one. This will change the transparency layering, fog interaction with the environment and players, but will greatly boost FPS, and that's where OIT comes in the most. OIT layers objects and textures with transparencies in a way that establishes the correct distance relative to the camera. In our screenshot that we've shown on the site, you can see this the best with the bridge and the pylon example that I've already given. And if you disable it, you lose that transparency layering, but you gain about 13% FPS if it's totally off. Anti-aliasing is the next critical item, which is really no surprise. By moving to no anti-aliasing from Filmic SMAA T2X, which is the default setting that we encountered for our setup, we saw an improvement of 10.3% FPS, and that's pretty big contrast to FXAA, which some folks will complain is a little bit blurry. FXAA reduces FPS about 1.5%, but it adds some level of anti-aliasing without getting the huge hit to performance. AA isn't necessarily that important to multiplayer gaming, so this is one of the first places I would go to increase your FPS. And if you're wondering what these options are, Black Ops 3 offers a lot of anti-aliasing settings, including the less familiar Filmic SMAA, which is also present in previous COD games. Filmic anti-aliasing tends to create a more cinematic experience. It uses multi-sampled temporal filtration, which is T2X. So it takes two samples, two taps per pixel, and applies that temporally, which means over time. So you're checking one frame to the next, sampling pixels in each frame, and then determining how the anti-aliasing changes the edges and the color of the graphics and things like that. It reduces the marching pixels effect in large part, and that is a big hit to FPS, so that's what I'd look at first for anti-aliasing, is changing that. High importance, moving down from critical to high, is the texture quality. You can see examples of texture quality in our screenshots, and this game has a massive impact on texture resolution when you change the quality. It goes from legible for very small signage to completely illegible, just a blob of color. And this one is potentially rated as a critical change in terms of FPS for users of GPUs with smaller frame buffers, but in general it's about a high importance. Texture quality corresponds with resolution of in-game textures, and low is so hideous that we'd really urge you to avoid going down to low. We'd push you more towards medium as a tolerable low-end hardware setting that still grants you an extra 5% performance over extra, especially with a smaller frame buffer, because extra does consume a huge amount of video memory. And you can see that delta comparison in our chart, where it's a couple gigabytes delta for extra on texture resolution. Ambient occlusion is of medium impact to FPS, and the screenshots we've demonstrated will show what ambient occlusion actually does. For the most part, AO will embolden points of contact between bordering surfaces, darken shadows where necessary, and dictate the proliferation of light reflection from some materials. Disabling AO increases FPS by about 5.9%, which is certainly noticeable, but not as much as the previous settings. And going from extra to medium gives a 3% FPS gain if you don't want to completely disable it. This is the first place to look after exhausting the previous settings if you really need more FPS, if you're on a lower end hardware setup. Volumetric lighting is the last setting we're talking about here. The rest you got to go to the article to get more information. Volumetric lighting has about a 4.7% performance range from none to high, giving us another few FPS if absolutely desperate for a few frames. We'd suggest running volumetric lighting on at least medium, as it does somewhat noticeably benefit the game's overall aesthetic and visuals. And volumetric lighting produces sort of a fill of light that radiates everywhere, just like we've got fill lights when we film these videos, where you have sort of one light that fills the room or the environment with a less intense light that provides some atmospheric glow. That's what volumetric lighting does, so I would recommend leaving it on to some level, and this is particularly noticeable with transparent textures and smoke or cloud or fog effects. After that, check out shadow map quality, then texture filtering and mesh quality, and the rest in the article if you're really running out of places to try and gain a few FPS. So that is the Black Ops 3 graphics optimization guide. We really like doing these. They're a lot of fun to learn about game graphics, and hopefully it gives you some good information. Even if you're not playing Black Ops 3, it still teaches what the settings do. And as always, if you like this kind of content, the best thing you can do for us is spread the word, share it, tell folks about it, and then hit that Patreon link in the post-roll video if you want to support us directly in creating more stuff like this. So check back this week for some Battlefront content and a couple of other cool videos we're working on. I'll see you all next time.